Hey, real quick, before we get started, we recorded this episode before the announcement was made that the Golden Geek nominations for 2023 are now open. So we just want to take this opportunity to ask you to please vote for Decision Space this year for Best Podcast. For those of you who don't know, Brendan and I each put in around 4 to 5 hours a week to create the best weekly board game podcast that we possibly can. There are very few opportunities for external promotion for us to grow our listenership beyond simple game group to game group word of mouth. The Golden Geek is by far the biggest opportunity that we know of for growth that comes around each year, where we can get our show in front of more board game enthusiast eyeballs. While our first priority in making the show is always and will always be to have fun, we, of course, also want to grow and share the show with as many people as possible. So I just want to thank you in advance for taking the time to vote for Decision Space once again this year. On a logistical note, nominations for Golden Geek can be a little bit complicated, so you have to have 20 Geek Gold on the Board Game Geek website to make a nomination. I'll include a link in the description of this podcast where you can go to make a nomination. So if you have any questions or any difficulty with that at all, please reach out to us in the Discord and we can get you squared away. All right, thanks again, and please enjoy the show.
Talking back.
Welcome to Decision Space, the only show to take place right here in the space between the turns in your favorite games. I'm Brendan Hansen.
I'm Jake Friedman.
And I'm Bill Collins.
And this is the podcast about decisions in games.
And today we have the awesome opportunity of doing a deep dive, critical look at the decisions in Ticket to Ride, a game that I imagine will be as familiar to our listeners as a whole as any we've ever covered on this show. So very excited to get into that episode, and also very excited to be joined by our friend, Bill Collins. So Bill, I just want to throw to you first and just give you the opportunity to introduce yourself, maybe just talk briefly about your relationship with board games, if you don't mind.
I'd be delighted to. So I go by the username Varianor on the boards, on the Discord, and just about everywhere I can get that username, so it's unique. I've been involved in board games 47 years, I want to say, which gives me time to have more depth of experience, but not necessarily deep experience. So I've played board games, RPGs, video games, computer games for roughly 5 decades, and I love it. The world has gotten to have more and more better and varied games. And so it's just going forward, you just have more to look forward to every day, every year. My problem is I don't have enough time to play it all. So that's the short version on me.
Awesome. Well, thanks again so much for coming on. And yeah, thanks for being such a good friend to us on the Discord. Everybody over on the Decision Space Discord knows you well. And it's just a delight to get the chance to bring you on this show. And for anybody listening, if you want to join us in our conversations there, you can find a link to that in the description of this podcast. One other just very small piece of housekeeping we wanted to say at the start of this episode before we get into the deep dive is just a plug for last week's episode. Brendan and I did what we talk about styled episode all about the design implications and the decision-making implications of drafting games. And it was sort of a part 2 in the drafting game series, or at least the second one to come out. And I think some people skipped over that, maybe because they didn't listen to part 1 or thought part 1 was a little too broad for them. So I just really want to encourage everybody to go back and check that out if you did skip it over, because I really think it's one of the better episodes that Brendan and I have done in a while. So just highly encourage people to go back and check that out.
Let's do what we always do on these deep dives, which is get right into our ratings and reviews, which will give people a bit of context for the conversation that's to follow. And I'm going to lead into that by saying, I think, Jake, maybe you can go first, then I'll go, and we'll let Bill have the final word. And Bill, I will say, we're excited to have you on the show for many reasons, but another is you have extensive knowledge of Ticket to Ride, and I think own a lot of Ticket to Ride content, which is very cool. So we'll delve into that in the show. Bill's sort of our Ticket to the Ride ringer.
Anybody who'd like to play a game, come to my house.
Yeah, so probably the most amateur Ticket to Ride player here would be myself, so I'll go first. For me, Ticket to Ride is the quintessential 7 rated board game, in that it's a game that I always find that I have a fun time when I play it, but it's rarely one these days that I'm recommending or wanting to go back to over and over again in my own time. Though again, happy to play it when it's brought out. And I think my story with Ticket to Ride is like so many others, where this was one of the games that first brought me into this hobby. One of the very first games I ended up buying. It might have been the second modern board game I bought after pandemic. So I just have to give it credit for that. Without Ticket to Ride, very likely, I wouldn't be doing this podcast right now. So it's like a game that like has this like historic value to me that's so quintessential. But then when I'm actually playing the game, at least the base game of Ticket to Ride, there are some sort of like criticisms I have with like the decision space that we'll get into more on the podcast, largely around pacing. So that's kind of where my criticisms come in. But overall, still a fun game today. And I'll pass it over to Brendan for his rating.
This is going to be an interesting one. Okay, it's easy to see why Ticket to Ride has ascended to mass market family game cabinet Hall of Fame. It's a brilliant game with a tense arc built on a rule set that could easily fit on a standard sheet of paper. While Ticket to Ride doesn't always stun with its ludological depth, it is rock solid and always delivers an above average experience that can at times overstay its welcome. Tense timing decisions and enough non-confrontational interactive blocking to provide memorable moments. Ticket to Ride is a triumph of design. 9.5 out of 10.
Wow.
I think this game's amazing, Jake. What are you on? Okay. Let's go to Bill.
I'm speechless already.
Speechless is good to be on as opposed to other things. I would say that my experience with Ticket to Ride has been so informed by playing it with my friends when it first came out, and then my kids. So as a design goes, I think there's a certain simplicity to it. I think there are still points where it could bog it down a little bit, but you go right past those because it just flows. So I give it a 9.
Dang, I like Ticket to Ride the most. I will say, I think part of my rating, I just want to be upfront about it too with how we're trying to contextualize. I think Ticket to Ride is one of the most brilliantly designed board games that we've ever unpacked on the show. So part of my rating is sort of, it's bolstering it from that point of view. Because I think there's so many reasons why Ticket to Ride became the game that it did that I want to try to unpack in this conversation. Sort of aside from if Jake was coming over, if I'd want to play it with him, or if Bill was coming over, if I'd want to play with you. Though, Bill, I think I'd want to play Ticket to Ride with you because you have all these maps and different experience with so.
Well, as longtime listeners know, the ratings are the least important part of the show, which is why we get them out of the way early. So let's jump straight into the game background and then deep dive discussion after that.
Okay, so Ticket to Ride came out in 2004 from Days of Wonder, and it's really one of their largest, it's their most successful game ever released. It won the Spiel des Jahres in 2004, the biggest sort of award in board games. It was designed by Alan R. Moon. There's a ton to sort of cover with Ticket to Ride in terms of what exists. And oftentimes we'll kind of delve into what's there a little bit. But I'll say that there's been 7 standalone city games so far. So there's just things like Ticket to Ride New York, Ticket to Ride London, Ticket to Ride Amsterdam, San Francisco. And these are the same rule set as the base game, but intended to be breezier, lighter, quicker experiences. 9 map packs for the base game of Ticket to Ride. 8 standalone follow-ups that have some rules twists. So Ticket to Ride Europe, Ticket to Ride Malarkin, Nordic countries, Germany, Rails and Sails, etc. I feel like I don't need to list them all out. It's extensive. But in the back half of the show, I know, Bill, you have some thoughts on some of these different iterations that we'll kind of delve into. Does that sound good? Okay. Awesome. And then I wanted to just provide a little bit more context here because Alan R. Moon, interestingly, talked a little on his Board Game Geek bio. As I was doing research for the show, I went and looked at that, and there's a great bio that I presumably he wrote of himself and his career there that I encourage anyone who's interested in the history of board games, who's mildly interested in Ticket to Ride, to take a peek at, because it talks about Alan R. Moon's experience trying to design games independently in the late 80s and really struggling to find a hit, and his approach of sort of starting his own company and different strategies he had of trying to release sort of small print runs to get traction among fans and then approach a larger publisher and try to get them to sign them. But I found sort of in trying to trace back some of this history that Ticket to Ride builds on some of Alan R. Moon's earlier games in a way that's really interesting. So there's a game that came out in 1990 called Airlines. that is really similar in some ways to Sid Sackson's Acquire, because players are competing to become majority stockholders in these companies that are sort of creating routes on a board. So that's 1990. And then he has another game, Union Pacific, that's another sort of train themed against stock market type game. We are building routes and going into these different companies. So Ticket to Ride really is a simplification of these previous two games that builds upon and kind of says, how can I distill this to its most base popular version? Well, it would become that. Maybe he didn't always know it would be. I also want to note that Alan R. Moon won the Spiel des Jahres before he won it for Ticket to Ride with a game called Elfenland in 1998. Do either of you have experience with Elfenland? No. I don't think it's not one that's played a ton these days, but it's on Board Game Arena as a curiosity if anyone's interested in taking a peek.
I would try
I'd
it.
try it too. Yeah.
Yeah, and that must be 1 year before Tikal,
yes,
right?
Yeah.
And then so that's kind of interesting, just like contextually, since we've been playing Tikal a ton, or at least I have. It's on Alpha in Board Game Arena right now, and that game holds up so well today. It's just a total blast. That now I kind of like want to see that it's just interesting, so that sticks out to me that this came out just before that.
And then the final game I wanted to mention in Alan R. Moon's Ludology, because I think most people sort of maybe know him for Ticket to Ride, is in 2005, he did Ink and Gold with Bruno Feduti, another amazing co-design that's sort of built on a really simple, clean turn structure, which is something I think we're going to talk about a lot with Ticket to Ride. It is a huge part of that game's success, in my opinion. But this isn't an Ink and Gold episode. It's the Ticket to Ride episode. So I figure maybe we can just get into it.
Sorry, I was just going to say, Bill, any thoughts you have there on the game background?
Two fun facts about Alan Moon. You might have heard in interviews with him. The first is that he was just walking by the ocean when he came up with the prototype for Ticket to Ride, and as he said, it was 85 to 90% complete, which I thought was fantastic because he had a lot more iterations and other designs. But then the other thing that was funny, in one interview in 2014, he said that he had worked as a waiter for 20 years, and he almost gave up on game design before Ticket to Ride became a hit. So that is, for anybody aspiring to be a designer, you got to stick with it and keep going and keep doing it.
That is amazing, and also a little bit frustrating just to be like, I just put out a prototype and it was just amazing. And then I sold it to the company, and then sold millions of copies.
But he spent those 20 years really struggling to find a hit, and then eventually got there, right? It's almost as if, what if the Beatles had toiled into their 40s looking for a hit and then finally broke it big?
He even paid back investors on a prior game of his that didn't work.
Wow. That's really cool.
All right, well, let's listen to Brendan's very brief rules overview, and then we'll meet back on the other side for the deep dive discussion.
Ticket to Ride is a set collection route building game played on a shared map for 2 to 5 players. In Ticket to Ride, players collect sets of matching colored train cards, which they then use to play train pieces to route of matching colors to the board. Each turn, players face a simple choice structure. They can either collect additional cards, play trains to the board, or take tickets. If they collect cards, the player can take 2 cards from a face-up display, or 1 wild card that can be used as any color, or draw 2 cards from the top of the deck, or draw a card from the top of the deck and take a card from the display. If they play trains, they use previously collected cards to lay down a route on the board. For example, trading in 5 blue cards allows the player to claim a route showing 5 blue trains and connects the 2 locations between those routes. Taking tickets means the player draws 3 tickets and chooses at least 1 to keep alongside the tickets they started the game with. Tickets provide endgame points for connecting 2 cities depicted on the board by building a series of routes between those 2 cities, all connected. Players receive, however, negative points for each ticket in their hand, equal to its point value at the end of the game if they do not complete the route. Players also receive points for claiming routes, with longer routes providing more points. There's a timing tension at the core of Ticket to Ride. Players want to draw cards to assess their options, but they also want to play to key routes on the board first, so they aren't blocked by other players, forcing inefficient detours. Play continues around the table until one player has just 0, 1, or 2 trains left in their player color, at which point each player, including the player who triggered the end of the game, gets 1 additional turn. The players combine their points for tickets, routes placed, and the player who has the longest continuous path of trains on the board receives 10 bonus points, at which point the player with the most points is crowned the victor.
Okay, thank you, Brendan. That was really well done. Very brief, but succinct but good. So that gives people a better idea of how to play this game. And let's get started with this. I kind of gave my background as Ticket to Ride being a game that kind of helped to bring me into this hobby in a bigger way. But let's do our just really quick Ticket to Ride personal histories. Brendan, let's do you and then end with Bill.
So I first played or saw Ticket to Ride being played in 2009 or 2010, I think. I went camping with some friends, and it was sort of a large camping excursion. And another group of people who I sort of adjacently knew but wasn't close friends with bought Ticket to Ride. So I didn't play in their game because their game filled up quickly. But I knew that I really wanted to play Ticket to Ride because they were all incredibly animated. I think there was some late game blocking that was going on that just stuck in my mind that made me think that at the time, Ticket to Ride must be this really cutthroat experience of game that, I think it maybe can be played that way a little bit, but ultimately isn't necessarily how I think of it the most. Like, Bill, you talked about how it's a fairly family-friendly game experience in a lot of ways. So that was my first encounter with Ticket to Ride. I played it a fair amount following that, sort of sought it out, played it with a group of friends, and played it virtually a fair amount, and then took a break from it for maybe 10 years and have recently gone back to it in hopes of covering it on the show and have just been enjoying it a ton.
Nice.
I think the first modern board game I bought was Pandemic, and I then invited friends over for my first game night, and one of them brought Puerto Rico, and we played that at like my first ever hosted board game night as an adult. And I think the second night after that, I went to the store and was like, did some research, like what game should I buy, and landed on Ticket to Ride, and so we played that at like the very next gathering, the next week, or maybe it was 2 weeks after that. And I think after playing Puerto Rico and just struggling through it, because it's a pretty complex game, playing Ticket to Ride was like so breezy and light, and people were, cracking jokes about like the, golden trains and, the multicolor ones. And we just had an awesome time with it. So yeah, I'll always have a really fond memory of that.
That's a great way to get started. I recommend it a lot of times to people who ask me, what should I get as a board game to start with my family? And that's one of 5 I will always recommend because it's so easy to teach. We started playing it in 2004. I have a friend who loves trains and has a model train set up in his house, and he had to get it. And so we started playing it right after he got it and played it. And it was just always a staple of gatherings with friends. And then we got Europe and played that for a bit. But then, sort of a funny memory that happened, I have a great friend in Denmark who brought his family over in 2014. And we played Ticket to Ride every night they stayed at my house. They were there for 4 nights, and we played 5 games of Ticket to Ride. So that kind of brought it all home. And then I've since tried to buy just about every map you can get to play it. So I think I'll be keeping going because they keep putting out stuff faster than I acquire it.
Very cool. That sounds like just a dream that somebody will like come and visit you and just like be really eager to play board games. I find myself always having to be like, we could play a board game if anyone's like up to that. And they're like, no, we'll just like watch Netflix or whatever. Like, okay, that's fine too.
You're not just pulling out just one or something similar to get them, hook them.
So, yeah, I'll usually will put something in front of people for sure. But yeah, I've yet to have the group come over and that wants to play the same game back to back 5 nights in a row. But anyway, why don't we get into characterizing the decision space, the size, depth, type, feel, and clarity, as we always do. So maybe we should start with the type. Is this kind of a waxing, waning, static, or dynamic decision space?
It's 100% waning, right? The game end trigger is when you run out of trains, or when you have 0, 1, or 2 trains. Essentially, run out of trains because the math needs to be fuzzy. The number of spaces on the board that you can play to is waning, which gives you that tense competition over locations. Also, just your opportunity to pursue tickets is waning. I think this is sort of a classic waning game. Your opportunity at the start is sort of huge. And not only that, the way you play typically is you build up in terms of drawing these different train cards, building up a hand. So you sort of punctuate the waning by building up even more and then rushing kind of towards that end game.
The only thing you could say that's maybe static is the deck, but even that declines as people draw from it and try to build up the cards to build their roots. And then occasionally it refreshes with a weird clump of cards. So even that is really waning.
Yeah, I mean, I can't disagree with you, gentlemen. Yeah, I think a classic waning decision space fits here. Let's jump now to the size and depth. And I know that there's a lot of different games, a lot of different maps, slightly different mechanics. So let's just think about the base game here. Do you all feel like this is a game that has small, moderate, or sort of large decision space as you're playing through the game?
I'd say it's pretty small because you have 3 choices, and there are sub choices, but that's 3 choices. So there's not a lot to think about. There's no combos to go for. It's what am I taking?
Yeah. I I feel the same, and I think even like to add on to that, not only so you have 3 choices, are you going to play cards, draw cards, or take tickets? You're not taking tickets that often, right? You're not going to take that action more than a couple times on average, unless you're doing like a really crazy strategy. So most of the game is going to be drawing cards or playing cards. And also, when you play cards, like by the time the way I play the game, it feels like by the time I'm playing cards, there's rarely like that many things I'm deciding between. Does that make sense? Like by the time I'm actually playing a track down, like I've already kind of predetermined it in the drawing card phase. Like I'm looking for red tickets among others, right? I'll be looking for a bunch of different colors all at once. But the reason I'm looking for red is so that I can like take this specific track.
Yeah, I obviously completely. I think you're both spot on. I think it's a fairly small decision space, but what makes this game interesting is not sort of the size or depth, but I think the clarity. Jake, you sort of said you feel like you just kind of know what you're going for once you have your hand of cards, and I think that's the goal with Ticket to Ride, right? It's a game where the best laid plans are always go to waste, right? Where there's this tension between getting more information and getting on the board. And the cool thing about Ticket to Ride is when you play your pieces to the board, you're committing and claiming locations that can give you a lot more efficiencies in terms of connecting routes if they're a key spot on the board. But you also, among people who've played a lot of Ticket to Ride, start to give people a sense of what you might be going for, what routes you might be trying to connect, and also might be tipping people off to how they can most effectively block you. So it's this amazing game of chicken in some ways, and also a juggling act of getting information versus committing information and committing pieces.
Absolutely. One of my favorite things to do in the game is to play a route somewhere and then play somewhere very differently if I know I can still link it up, because that confuses people. They all know what the routes are if you've played this enough. They know every single destination in that pile.
That's fascinating to me because I have never really even considered, I don't think I've played it enough against like expert players that, so I personally have never considered for a second in my head, like what specific ticket somebody has, but I have seen, I just like consider like the space occupied on the board. So Bill, if you put you're in 2 places at once, I just like am gonna like let you do your own thing until those train tracks start coming together. And now I feel like there's opportunity where I can at least make your life inconvenient, if not really blow up your plans by trying to snag some tracks that are, links between your two.
I would agree with that. I would say that, and looks like Brennan has something he has to say too, that this is earlier start of the game and mid game, because by end game, you have to be finishing your routes. And you always want to bake in a workaround plan in your mind. Okay, I know I need to go from Portland to Houston, but if I can't go there this way, which other way am I going to get there that I cannot be blocked? So that's a lot of the fun of the decision.
I think that you guys have just highlighted 2 things that I think are so cool about Ticket to Ride. So one, Bill, what you just said, this sort of going around, is ultimately Ticket to Ride, like all sort of modern sort of strategy board games, is a game about efficiencies, but it doesn't sort of lay them so bare that if you invite your friend over who's never played a board game, that they can't engage with it, because it's just about building these routes. So it's intuitive to us as people who go about the world that if you have to go around something, it's going to be less efficient than if you can go there directly, right? In a way that if I invite someone to play, oh gosh, I don't know, Lost Ruins of Arnak, the efficiencies of converting different things within that game and the timing puzzle of those pieces might not be as clear, I think. I think it's like really direct in that way. But then the other thing that just jumped into my mind that I wanted to comment on, Bill, is I think you had talked about, or I had mentioned that in some ways, Ticket to Ride kind of follows this lineage of train games and route building games with games like Union Pacific that Alan R. Moon had done previously. And then obviously just it is in this lineage of train games within board games that exist, but it has this awesome abstraction that I think makes the game so much more interesting, which is that you can play pieces anywhere on the map whenever you want, right? Thematically, that doesn't make a ton of sense, but it gives the players just enough agency to make interesting decisions. Bill, for you to go, maybe place between San Francisco and Los Angeles all the way on the West Coast, and then play something up in the Northeast is just not something you typically do in train games, but it invites you to engage with one another a bit more directly and also obfuscate your plans, I think, in a really interesting way. And it creates sort of more tension than you would otherwise have, where you would have even more of the problem that Jake was talking about potentially of, oh, I'm just executing the plan that I've already laid out before myself,
I could see Jake deliberately taking lines to just stop people because it's fun.
Yeah, 100%. And also, what I'm hearing from Brendan is that this game is really a 10 out of 10 for him. It's just if it thematically held together just a little bit more.
What? No. I do want to.
I just think that's so funny. I've literally never heard in all the discussion I've seen about Ticket to Ride anybody being like, yeah, but just thematically, it doesn't really make sense.
It actually, though, a cool thing that I think that makes the game work even better is how the density of cities on the East Coast versus the longer routes on the West Coast, and the sort of, I don't think you end up with exactly the right feel to the map, maybe, if you don't sort of model it on a real world space in the way it exists. I don't know that you end up with quite exactly this type of interesting map. Maybe you do. I don't know. It could just be whatever, just this abstract mathematic puzzle. But it's cool. It matches sort of the real world United States in a way that's interesting in terms of the strategic sort of depth that you can create there. Jake's like shaking his head, but I think it leads to interesting decisions.
No, what you're saying that makes a lot of sense to me, Brendan, is like the game does a great job of signposting to players the types of things that they should be doing to score reasonably well.
Sure.
You've got your destination tickets that show 2 cities and a route between them. That's like a direct route, right? Like try and do this. That will be effective. It shows you right on the board, right? If you build a longer train track at once, right? If I spend 6 cards to get a 6 track train, was it like 18 points, 20 points? It's a bunch of points.
20 for 6, 15 for 5.
Yeah, 20 points. Where if I spend 6 cards to get 6 1-track ones, that's going to be 1 point each, right? It's literally signposting that to players as like a point thing, but that's also kind of like subtly signposting them like efficiency too, because if I can do all this in 1 move versus 6 moves, that's like more of like an advanced kind of strategy game concept of efficiency, like you're talking about in Lost Ruins of Arnak. But here it all operates on the exact same principle, and I think that does make it easy for newer players to jump in and start having fun in a competitive way right away.
And that leads to the blocking, where you see somebody going for efficiency and you can take a move that benefits you and also blocks out their routes. And that's where some of the biggest screams from players come from.
I go for it, Jake.
I was just going to say, any final thoughts on the overall decision space in the game? And I want to kind of get into the nitty gritty of some of the actual like decisions that we might be making on a given turn and all of that.
I think that maybe the only thing that I want to note is we'd be remiss maybe in talking about the overall decision space, as I'm sure we'll talk about the ticket system at some point in terms of clarity. I think that one of the decisions that sort of leaves me with a little bit of pause, though clearly it's tough to criticize Ticket to Ride given the success that it's had, is the ticket system itself and the lack of clarity there in terms of getting completely positive points if you finish a route, negative points if you don't, and having very little. You can be sort of late game and in a position where you'd really love to have a ticket or two more and just have complete uncertainty around what you're going to draw in a way that feels really bad potentially. And it's just this sharp output randomness edge that doesn't necessarily exist in a lot of games of this sort of, I don't know. It doesn't feel particularly modern in that way, but it makes it work at a family level pretty well.
Ironically, because being the person that had the lowest rating of this game,
Yeah,
and
it doesn't
also
bug you?
perhaps the person that hasn't spent a second of my life thinking about what tickets are possible, it doesn't bother me at all, because like the way I look at that is like, what is my relative position in the game, and if like the vibe I'm getting is that I'm behind, then I don't care if I miss, right?
Go fishing.
It's
yeah.
worth it for me just to take that risk and see if I just spike a ticket that I just happen to already have achieved, or maybe I'm like one city away, so I still have a good chance if I leave myself like a turn or two remaining in the game. That feels totally fine to me. So I think maybe I would feel more frustrated about it if like I had sort of spent more time, effort, kind of like thinking about what's possible and like tried to like do the odds a little bit more, and then I missed. But maybe that just says more about my psychology as a game player.
I have a question. So much of this game is the build up at the beginning, right? You're drawing these cards because there's no hand limit, which is one of the other sort of, in my mind, brilliant decisions of Ticket to Ride that makes the game.
Is
Yes,
it
absolutely,
really?
Jake.
Okay.
Absolutely. But I guess we could talk about that in a minute. But the other thing is you can draw as many of the tickets as you want, and you can keep as many as you want. It's a draw 3, pick at least one to keep. How many did the two of you, when you're playing, how many tickets do you like to have in your back pocket in the sort of early game to go for? I love that this game says, how greedy do you want to be? I often find myself with 4 or 5 tickets, which I don't think is optimal.
No. For me, and having just lost Europe Saturday with taking 4 tickets at the start, I can tell you that I agree with that statement. I don't look for tickets, I look for overlaps. I'm always going to be taking my tickets based upon, can I overlap these routes and how many places it take to get them? And so, and there can be circumstances like if you get the right draw on USA, you'll get 2 of those 20 and 22 point tickets across the country. That can give you the game if you fulfill those. And so you toss away everything else and just go for those. But Jake's experience could be different.
I mean, I think I'm really closer to you, Bill. One thing I really like to do, if possible, early in the game is like if I have one ticket that's big, right? Like it is taking me across the country. Like ideally I have something like that, and obviously you're not always guaranteed to have that, but I think that's a huge advantage because then I can find my way to 1 or 2 other tickets along that route almost definitely. We're having multiple small ones. They might be in different parts of the country too, and like also, it's just, I feel like that just makes it a lot harder to build your strategy around. At least the way that I tend to play this game. So I think that's kind of like finding 1 or 2 tickets early, ideally one being like a significant investment, and going from there.
I contradict myself. I say I don't like the ticket system, and then I engage with it. So that's great. Maybe we should refocus as we sort of move beyond this characterizing of the overall decision space on some of the sort of core decisions offered by the game. And I think we have to sort of foreground that discussion in some ways around this idea that at the heart of this game, Ticket to Ride is driven by this sort of rummy set collection game with a twist, right? That's really the heart of Ticket to Ride. You're collecting cards of the same color that you're going to use to play them down. And I think an interesting thing about Ticket to Ride is the number of suits in the game. There's 8 suits, meaning different colors of train cars that you can be going for that are all represented on the board. And there's wild cards. And I think it's enough that given the face-up display that's there, you can be forced into situations where your color just isn't coming up more often than I think it seems like you might when you first start playing the game. And I think that I like that because it forces you to sort of pivot and change your plans, or to just invest and spend more time wasting potential opportunity on the board. I think Ticket to Ride with 6 suits feels too certain and too procedural in a way that it really doesn't with 8. And in some ways, it just feels like the sweet spot in a lot of ways.
I would say that this impossibility of card counting with 142 cards in 8 suits and the wilds is also a great feature of the game. The decision to take a locomotive to get something you absolutely need to have, especially if you're going for a 5 or a 6 car route, can be agonizing because you want to keep getting more cards to further your domination on the board, but you don't have that certainty. So do I take that locomotive to make sure I get it? Later and later in the game, I think you absolutely do.
Just snag the wild card and just accept that you get. I do love this structure, the decision making of, do I just take one wild? Do I take two face up of colors I only will need if I get the other colors that I need first, or do I just risk it and pull off the top? And it gives you a nice sense of agency, I think, in juxtaposition with the ticket system. But yeah.
I've like this one of my kind of criticisms with the game, where I feel like the more I play the game, the less I'm engaging with the set collection kind of puzzle, and I just go with general orientation towards the game. Like I'm collecting 5 or 6 different colors, at least especially at the start of the game. And when you're doing that, it makes you want to just take off the top of the deck where you have a chance of hitting the wild, and that doesn't take your whole turn. Because getting a wild card and another card in Ticket to Ride, you can only do that if you're drawing off the top of the deck, and that feels like just a really, really strong turn. So there's kind of like an inherent advantage to that anyway. And so, maybe it's good to kind of talk about this now, but the way I have tended to play Ticket to Ride lately is spending like the first 10 plus turns of the game, if not more, just drawing cards. And the advantage of that is that by not going on the board early, it's impossible for people to block me because my sort of path has not yet been set. I can kind of set my path around other people. And then, once I'm satisfied with the hand I've built up, I can just take a sequence of turns, bang, 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 where I'm laying down trains that are all connected. Of course, it's possible that somebody is going to put down something in a space that I was hoping to get to. But when you're building train tracks all connected to each other, you could also be going off in any direction. So people really have to, I guess, possibly they know what ticket you have in your hand that you're hoping to achieve if you're playing with some real sharks. But if not for that, right, they're just making a wild guess about what's going to be blocking you, as opposed to like if you're building in 2 different areas and like, okay, well, in between those is a potential block. Do you guys play the game differently? Does that make sense to you? Does that kind of like diminish this kind of the decisions you're making in the taking cards part of the game?
I don't. I tend to play exactly the same way, except I might go more than 10 turns.
Yeah, right.
I think that's absolutely the game arc of Ticket to Ride. But I think that, Jake, for me, I've come to accept it as a feature, not a bug, because I think it's this really interesting game of chicken at the heart of Ticket to Ride. I think you're underrepresenting the value of certain key routes on the board that I think if you get to them early enough can be really pivotal, just depending, right? Like there's places like blocking Seattle, I think can be really crushing for people, depending on sort of the tickets that they're playing, or likewise, Los Angeles ends up being a really key city in terms of trying to get there and how inefficient or efficiently you can get there. And there's just different cities across the board like that. So I think there's real tension between wanting to build up and build these sets versus claiming these sort of key locations on the board and making sure that you are snagging efficiencies. So I find myself doing a bit of both at times. But no, that's the game arc of Ticket to Ride, right? You build up, you build up, you build up, and then you get to this really, the balloon is full, and then you're all going to sort of blow the balloon out at the same time, and hopefully yours doesn't get popped.
And then you build up and build up and build up again. And I think that kind of like that pace feels just a little bit stuttering to me in a way that I find not like wholly satisfying in an hour long experience, right?
Sure.
Which I think is how long like the larger games tend to play at the table.
Yeah.
Now I know we'll talk about a little bit at the end some of the other like smaller city versions of the game, which sound like give you that full experience in 25 minutes or whatever. And I think that might be more to my taste for kind of like the pacing sense. So it's a personal thing, and maybe it's like a small critique. But for whatever reason, that kind of like just we're all drawing cards, we're all drawing cards, we're all drawing cards, and we're all playing cards, and then we're kind of like doing that again. I don't know, like it definitely flows fast around the table for sure. So it's not a criticism of the flow, but just more of like I don't know, somehow like if another game is like kind of has like a more dynamic kind of dance between people taking all different actions, like in some ways that can feel a little bit more satisfying to me, I think.
Do you think Ticket to Ride would be made better, Jake, by just starting with a hand of 10 cards?
I can't see any downside to that at all.
That's a fascinating thought, Brendan. That would be different. I should try that sometime. You'd have to get a really good shuffle on the deck.
It's really interesting, right? Because in some ways, Jake, I hear what you're saying, but I do think that looking at those 5 cards that come up, for me, there are meaningful decisions sometimes in the colors that I want to go for, looking at what colors other people are taking and trying to read those signals on what routes they might be trying to play to. I'm not the best Ticket to Ride player in the world, but I think that there's a lot more subtlety in Ticket to Ride that's sort of hidden below the surface, that the more you play this game, the more you get out of it in a really delightful way that I think feels, I imagine, sort of justifies those early turns in the way that you take or hide signals there. And I think that because there's 8 cards, your hand can just get mired in, oops, I grabbed too much junk. Like, oh, I have all these pairs that I can't play to the board anywhere because I'm trying to play in the West and I need these large sets to actually play anything to the board. And instead, I can't do anything and I'm not pulling the pieces together. I don't know. Do I think it's the deepest sort of decisions in those early turns of any game I've ever played? No. Is it the most exciting sort of part of any game I've ever played? No. But I like that it builds to these sort of tense moments of, okay, who's going to be the first to the board? And then where are the sort of blocking choke points going to be?
Or even when you get the scenario such as 2 players suddenly decide to build from Duluth down to Houston and fill the Mississippi Valley. And now you have to go across that where you were expecting to just go right through it and they're branching off in both. And that can really upset your plans.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the actual, taking a card portion of this game gets more interesting in sort of like the second half, right? Now all of a sudden the card suits have a lot more meaning to me because as you said, right, the board's filling up in the middle. I know I'm gonna have to go across that Mississippi Valley. So all of a sudden it's like now I need green cards. So now I'm gonna, take a green card revealing, oh, it was like a wild on top of the deck. I missed it, even though I've been drawing the top all game long. Like those are some of the most fun moments of Ticket to Ride for me. But I think for me, like that's kind of getting back to that pacing, small critique is like it feels more often than not that's like only kind of happening in like the second half of the game. And I just wish we were kind of like getting into that kind of like the fun. That's where I find the fun of Ticket to Ride a little bit earlier, like without the whole song and dance of like everybody spending 10 plus turns just drawing cards and then just kind of like dumping their hand. And like now I feel like at that point I'm like starting to really engage in the core fun decisions of the game.
I will agree with you that can be a little slow at the beginning. And then you get those scenarios like where there's 2 locomotives and 3 of one color up. And then you're almost forced to top deck. But that could lead to that thrill of, I just drew 2 locomotives. Aha.
Yeah, absolutely.
Jake, I feel like this might be the time to talk about the hand limit because you kind of guffawed earlier when I said that there not being a hand limit was a good thing in Ticket to Ride. And this, I think, is where it would most naturally fit in the conversation. So you sort of take pause at this idea that Alan Armoon wants us to build up hands, big hands of cards, right? The design says to do it, right? Like there's no limit.
I think that's like kind of like the metagame moves to that direction. You might not do that. I don't like that first night when I was playing Ticket to Ride with a bunch of novice board gamers.
Yeah.
I don't think we were doing that. Like, it took a game or two before you realize, like, wait, I'm not looking for red and green cards. I'm looking for red and green and blue and pink and white cards.
Yeah.
And that changes the decision space considerably.
Yeah, the set collection aspect will drive the game. And when you first start off, you're just like, oh, I'll just complete this little route and this little bigger route. And, and you're satisfied with that.
Another thing that I really love about there not being hand limits, right, is the decisions that get created by the wild card spaces on the board. Ticket to Ride ends up being so much more interesting because of these wild routes than it would ever be without it, right? If all the routes were colored in on the board, the game would be too tense and too structured, and there wouldn't be as interesting decisions to be had around what trains to turn in. And I think, Jake, you end up in these interesting situations for me when you have this clutch of cards and you have a pivotal point that you need to play to, and maybe you haven't gotten quite enough of a specific color and you need to make a push for it. to sort of say what should I be spending to sort of play to these wild spots. I think you can have interesting decisions there that are sort of fun and dependent on what you've seen other people going for as well. Because a huge part of Ticket to Ride for me is sort of thinking through, am I competing for colors that other people are also interested in pulling into their hands? Can I rely on that sort of pair of pink train cars sitting there and wheeling? Can I risk pulling off the top? That's where some of the interesting decisions really pop for me, that without the sort of, if you had a hand limit of, say, I don't know, seven trains, and if once you get there you have to play them to the board or something, I think the game is too stuttering. It's tough to plan. The decision space would collapse in on itself. Obviously, Jake, I'm not saying that you're suggesting you do that. You're clearly not. But I think it's sort of, for me, the no hand limit is the brilliance that kind of allows the decision space to be what it is and kind of flies in the face of conventional design. This idea that, like, no, you can have a hand of 15 cards. Why not?
Yeah, I don't think I would put the hand limit at 7, but I I do
20.
I don't think 20 would make it like a significantly worse experience. And I
Sure.
think that could also create, I think all those decisions you're talking about could happen there as well. And maybe also you have a tough choice about, like, dang, like there's cards I want there, but if I take them, I'll go over the hand limit. So maybe I have to like play to the board a little earlier than I would want.
Sure.
And I just think that for me would kind of like mix up like the familiar pattern that just seems to happen in the base game. Now, of course, I think the game's solution to that is that there's like a billion other boards and games and versions you can play once, okay, like our America games have become a little bit rote. Well, that's okay because there's plenty of option and variety available to you. So this is not like an anti Ticket to Ride take, but I think some of the roteness that I'm starting to feel in that base game is partially created from like the no hand limit thing, because that's what creates the fact that at the beginning of the game we're just all taking cards for like the first however long.
It might also avoid the second greed problem in the game. Brendan's point about tickets, destinations is one, but then with unlimited hands, sometimes you're sitting there going, I just need one more round to get 2 more cards to really perfect my perfect route across the country, and then somebody takes one key thing you needed. And that was the mistake you made, was just not going for it right then and there.
Yeah, which is so opaque, right? Like, let's transition away from taking cards to like placing trains and like the decisions you make there too. Because, right, like that, the key decision there is like timing, because the opportunity cost is that if you don't take a route when you can, somebody else has the opportunity to potentially take it and force you into a less optimal path or kind of a less efficient strategy in the game. So what are you guys thinking about when it comes to like, okay, now is the moment, right? What triggers you to start playing train, like actual claiming routes after that first portion of the game?
That's a great question. I tend to just, Jake, I think I tend to probably play to the board too soon. I think it's really hard to play with discipline the way you're probably supposed to play Ticket to Ride if you're playing in a hyper competitive setting, where you just build up, build up, build up, get information, and then play. Obviously, we've talked a lot about how a huge part of Ticket to Ride is trying to overlay these sort of tickets that you're getting. So if there's key cities, let's say you have 3 cities that you're coming that overlay with a certain city, that's where I'm starting, right? I'm starting with where I'm overlaid so I can make sure that I'm hitting all those places and kind of going at the nexus of where all of my tickets are. But I think another huge part is just, if I this is a game of chicken, right? How do games of chicken work? When someone makes a move, all of a sudden there's this tension on the board to then get on the board yourself. So I think sometimes it can be interesting to sort of play early and see if you can sort of goad anyone to coming out on the board. I think it also depends on if you're playing, if you think you're going to be more on the West Coast, moving sort of east, or if you're going to be trying to pick up a bunch of cities and connecting small tickets on the East Coast. Those kind of are different sort of puzzles in some ways for me, if I'm playing the sort of north-south game versus the east-west game, as it were. Because I think if I'm playing north-south a little bit more, I'm in a game right now where I'm going from, I have a bunch of tickets where I'm sort of headed from Montreal to New Orleans, and then on the way trying to hit Chicago and New Orleans. That one I felt like I had to get down early because there was a high potential for other people sort of blocking me. I don't know. I might be off base there. But
No, you're right, Brandon. That's the basics of the strategy. Two points. One is that there's also sort of a diagonal game you can play. It's not thought about as much, but you can actually, with the right routes, play the diagonals across the board. That's actually sometimes easier than playing the straight left, right, up, down game. For me, the second point is that I will wait to try to place optimally unless I see somebody's put down something that's going to completely jeopardize a route. And it's hard to point to a single placement. It's all a timing puzzle of, oh no, somebody just went from Philadelphia out along the 5 green route. I needed that, so now I need to plan around that. And do I place now to avoid the next piece of that? Or if I'm going across the country, there's just some legs you absolutely want to get early. That little one-piece route down by Houston. If you don't get that early on, you're done. If you're trying to go along the south of the coast.
Yeah, there are some spaces too where they're like a double route, right? Like there's 2 routes right next to each other that maybe have just take one card or 2 cards to play down. And I see a pattern a lot in games where like as soon as one gets taken, then the next one gets taken like right away. And so that's something that can trigger me if I see one of those gone and I have the opportunity to take it. Like maybe I just snag it whether I want it or not, just to mess with people. But often I do want it, right? Because they're just like good pivotal places. And I've been on the losing side of that too, where like, dang, nobody had played anything, and then like the first 2 things down just like took something that I could have needed. So that's one thing that can like trigger me. And the other big thing I think is often when I'm looking at my like overall strategy in the game, right? Like I've got this, am I going diagonal? Am I going east west? Or am I going north south? I want to try and find like a 5 or ideally 6 segment route to claim. And so that might be kind of like the crown jewel, right? That's going to be a really efficient way of covering space on the board. It's going to score me the most possible points. So if I'm able to, in my mad collection of 25 cards to start the game, if I've managed to get 6 white ones and that's in my space, like why not just take it now and make sure I'm like locking down that just like efficiency and point boost over other players.
your
So
foundation.
I'll often start the game with one of those big routes.
I think that for me, a lot of the way that this plays out too is varies by player count in an interesting way in Ticket to Ride. 3-player games of Ticket to Ride are, I think that's my favorite way to play because you end up with interesting blocking dynamics where it's not a zero-sum game, but you still, all of the sort of double routes are actually single routes. Whenever someone plays to one of them and claims them, it automatically blocks the other one. And I find that makes the game even more tense because you end up everywhere is already in the position that Jake had said invites him to play to the board. But you still have this sort of flexibility and the potential where, say, from Kansas City to St. Louis, there's the blue line or the pink line. You still have both options until someone claims it and then it disappears. And I think that, to me, Jake, gives the game more of that variable game arc and feel that you're kind of missing. You feel the game is almost feels too static and too samey every time. At 3 players, I think that can lead to it feeling a little bit more varied than it will at sort of 4 players. I like my Ticket to Ride to play a little quicker, so a 3-player game tends to play a little quicker, which I tend to enjoy. I like Ticket to Ride at 2. I guess I'm going into player count sort of preferences here, but I think it's good at 4. I'm much less interested in 5. I think 5 just gets so clogged and claustrophobic, it feels like a different game and you're not always accomplishing quite as much as you would like. And I think for me, one of the real joys of Ticket to Ride is that you get to accomplish something. You get to envision this route and then build it out. And it's fun to do that. I want to do that. I don't want to do it perfectly because some of the fun of Ticket to Ride, right, is solving the problems that other players throw at you. But ultimately, if I'm going to play Ticket to Ride, I want to lay a big route down on the board, and I want the dopamine hit, like Jake said, of playing a 6 route and getting this crusher points,
and not taking 7 negative points at the end of the game. Yeah,
right. Or maybe if in my case, if I've taken too many of the tickets, negative 27 or negative 30. Yeah,
I think I have to try at 3. I don't know that I've played many times at 3. I think the vast majority of my plays have been 4 or 5 players.
sure.
4 can be pretty good. 5 is definitely a punch in the coal car, punching fight in the coal car. And so oftentimes in 5, the person who wins is the one who's building where nobody else is building, and nobody realizes that, and they just manage to get it all together.
Yeah, I think like one of the great things about like recommending Ticket to Ride as a game for newer players is the flexibility of it. and it may not be best at 5, but it still plays fast at 5, right? So you could still get it done in like about an hour or so playing at the table.
It's a good game at
And
any count. It's definitely a good one at 3 and 4.
yeah. Yeah, and I just say that to say like I think when I've had my like physical copy come out the most, it's sort of like, oh, we've got like 5 people. We want to do something that's not like a party game. Like, oh, we could actually play this and it won't take forever. Even if it's not the best, it's definitely like a big value add to the game.
Well, as we pivot into kind of the sort of closing thoughts on decisions and Ticket to Ride, do either of you have anything that you feel you've really missed of where, from a decision perspective, the game really pops? I want to highlight just the turn structure. I think the turn structure in Ticket to Ride of do one of these three things is so brilliant and simple. It makes it easy to teach, but you still feel like you have enough agency that it doesn't feel totally frivolous. I don't think, at least in my experience, and it guides the players through that sort of game if you're more a newer sort of player to playing sort of strategy games. And I think that that's one of the sort of the other brilliant foundation that this game is built on for me. So I want to highlight this. It's a great turn structure, right? Just do these two things, and then maybe once or twice in the game do this third thing. And I think that decisions where you have that imbalance end up being even more interesting in some ways, because knowing when and why to make the decision you should rarely do can be as interesting as just trying to balance out three sort of decisions you're supposed to make in even turn.
It's easy to teach and easy to master. So for me, the point that I would highlight is the end game, where your plans are supposed to be coming together. But did someone suddenly trigger the end of the game? And now are you scrambling going, oh no, how do I best mitigate my disaster? Or if you're the person who's kind of in the catbird seat, you're just watching the table and going, well, I get an extra turn too. So what are you going to do? And then you see who out of the 2 or 3 top people got the actual points and won.
I agree with you again, Bill. I think for me, the end of the game is the most exciting part of the game. And right, like we talked about at the beginning, this is like a waning decision space game, and a really clear example of that. And I think almost at the beginning of the game, things feel like, to my taste, almost too open to where you don't really feel like you're engaging with the game in like a really exciting way until the middle. But then that just ratchets up, right, in the intensity as spaces get taken. You start to realize, like, are my plans possible or not? And
Oh
then
my God, I've got 5 cards and I can only play a 2-point route, and there's no 2-point routes. What do I do?
yeah, and like that, I think it gets my brain going, really trying to like navigate those last few turns to do it in the most efficient way possible. Like, can I be the person to trigger the end game? Like, what kind of cards could I possibly hope to draw? Like, what if I've given up on a ticket or something? Like, well, okay, so how am I going to maximize my point potential in these last few turns? I think that's a really fun puzzle, and the game's definitely really sings there, and leads to an exciting conclusion.
Bill, as we pivot into the end of this episode, I'm really curious. Do you have thoughts on some of the alternative maps or just different versions of the game that you've played that you think are notable or interesting or novel? It's such a blind spot for me, and I'm curious. You've mentioned some things that sort of sound neat.
Yeah, well, first I'd say is play them all. They're all fun. If you get friends to buy the copies so you don't have to own a library full of the map packs, you're saving a little bit of money. But, you can come to my place. No, in terms of first, I'd say for Jake's benefit, the smaller, newer games that came out where you get in a 20 to 25-minute play, they only have 6 suits. The board is small, so it's the exact same flavor of the game in a much shorter time frame with a slightly different rule set. So for me, if we were playing a weekend's worth of games and nobody wants, we're getting ready for a big game, you might pull out one of the little ones just to get through 15 minutes while somebody's doing a setup or people are finishing up another game so you can all reconvene. So I like those a lot. They only just started coming out with them. Ironically, also, Jake, they started coming out with them after Pandemic had its success with its smaller pandemics. So somebody in the publishing world said, ha, we want to capitalize on this and get out additional games and sell more plastic train cars. And I've bought almost all of them. But in terms of the map packs themselves, there are so many. I'd say that the 3 to try that are the most different, we'll go in reverse order, would be the bullet trains, the Japan map. First off, it gives you fewer trains totals. You have to go through the setup to find that. It's buried in there, which is, I wish they didn't do that. But so you get fewer trains, so the game's going to go faster. The island's also, smaller than the continental US. The bullet trains are built on shared tracks, but the person with the most bullet points get the most points at the end of the game off of a table. the person with no bullet trains takes minus points. So you have to build a shared network and then branch off to finish your individual tickets. So that's pretty neat. Then the second most interesting one, or equally interesting one, is Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania map introduces stock, and there are stock symbols printed on the map. When you complete a route, you claim a stock symbol, and the more symbols you get, the more points you get at the end of the game. So it takes what is strictly a tactical game of making decisions and playing down trains, go from one of also, how do I accumulate these sets of stock, and do I take this route now to make sure I get stock certificate number 1, which gives you the tiebreaker for the vote to get the most points, or do you not care, or do you try to go heavy into the stock that you can get 12 out of 16 out of? So that's a really big change to the base game, and everybody seems to like that I've played it with. And then the final one is United Kingdom, the UK map, which is set back at the very beginning of the train era, and you have to literally buy the technology to build a thing bigger than a 2 route on the board. And you have to build the technology to go across the channel to Ireland or to France, and all sorts of other things in the game. So that one really takes the game off in a different direction, I think is fun. But any of the maps, I'd play any of the maps. And we should probably mention, since we didn't touch on it, Europe, where Europe is a little kinder because you get the stations, and you can have a broken route that you can still put a station down, and as long as it's at one end of the connection on the route, you still get to finish the points. You lose 4 points for the station because an unused station is 4, but getting 21 points and giving up 4 is much better in my mind than taking minus 21 points. So those are the big variants, but they're all a ton of fun.
So Europe is the only other one I've played, and it also has like mines or mountain
Tunnels.
tunnels. That's what it is. And that one you have to like. Do you remember off the top of your head? It's like you have to like reveal cards from the top of the deck.
Yeah, you draw 3 cards from the top of the deck, and so say you're trying to play a 2 black tunnel, so 2 black train car tunnel. If you draw 3 more black train cars off the top of the deck, you have to have 5 in hand, or some combination of locomotives plus the color required. So that introduces this really interesting risk element that's actually reflective
like push your luck almost.
It's reflective of them actually building the tunnels through the Swiss Alps in places where the blast might not actually be where they expected it to be, and they might have to go through thicker, harder rock or something like that. And then there's even the 8-length tunnel that goes across the very north of the map. So to build that, think about it. You want to hedge your bets and have 8 cars of one color, and probably at least 2 locomotives or 2 more cards of that same color to be sure that you're not going to lose that tunnel.
I always remember being like shocked by, it's like a family weight game, and then it just has this like very punishing little push your luck mechanism in it. So that definitely changes it up. And for me, I think made it one that I owned it at one point, and I think I got rid of it and kept my base game just because I found myself more often playing Ticket to Ride as like a family weight game with like newer people. So like introducing that like punishing thing.
I think the cards go back into your hand, but you just don't build the tunnel. But still, it's a huge setback. You got to do it again.
Skip your turn is still not a good feel. So anyway, that's awesome. Yeah, I would love to play some more of these. I think the stock one sounds particularly interesting. And I know, I've got some friends that have really been telling me that the city ones, I think San Francisco specifically is one that has been recommended to me a few times. So the fact that you could play it in 20 minutes flat sounds like it'd be worth checking out.
That's on my list to play. That's the one I don't own.
Oh no, sorry, Bill.
No, you don't have to apologize.
Yeah, that's the best one. Come on.
I think that it's so interesting because when in some ways, as I talked about my personal history with Ticket to Ride, in that intervening gap, I'd almost written Ticket to Ride off in some ways as sort of something that I was really glad to have played and experienced, but not wanted to explore further. And I think that I had assumed that a lot of these maps were really just maps. It was the same game, but it's Ticket to Ride, but with a different map. Great. But it's so interesting that as you delve deeper, and this is just my own naivete showing through, that almost all of these sort of map packs are actually just expansions. They're different games. It's a twist with the same exact rules. And I think that it's amazing how many of them, Bill, just as you rattled through 3 there, sound really novel and interesting. Like Alan R. Moon really flexing his design muscles, doing something cool within the system and saying, no, there's more. This game can handle, this system is robust enough to actually handle pushing and pulling in all these different directions, which is cool.
I think you'd even like some of the maps like India, Brennan, which is both beautiful and incredibly competitive. It's so tight, yet it lets you complete what are called mandalas, and you can complete up to 3 of them. So if you complete loops of your routes, you get points, and you can do this up to 3 times. So it is almost impossible to pull it off. But the first time you get 3 mandalas on a board, it's an amazing rush.
That sounds really cool. And a whole different play pattern. Again, inviting
Yes.
you to do something totally different that you would never think of doing in the base Ticket to Ride. Awesome.
And I think it just speaks to the elegance of the core mechanisms that, whatever other mechanism you want to put on top of it, whether it's stocks or push your luck or legacy, as we know, there's the brand new legacy game.
Sold out. You cannot buy a copy.
All of that seems to, work just fine and add an interesting wrinkle. But, I think all these games too, from what I understand, still very much feel like Ticket to Ride.
Yes. Maybe Amsterdam, which has the carts, feels a little different.
All right. Well, any final thoughts on Ticket to Ride here? Or Bill, any final thoughts in general about your experience coming on the podcast? I welcome it at this kind of final hour.
Well, I'd say if you play the game, great. If you haven't, try it because it's so approachable for everybody. And then thanks for having me on. This was great to have a discussion and be part of one of my favorite parts, the deep dives.
Of course. Well, thank you so much for coming on. And Jake, it's always a pleasure getting to talk about a game like this. I feel, oftentimes when we do these deep dives, I feel like we've really explored and plumbed the depth of the game. And it's interesting because I feel like just pivoting to these conversations, the world of Ticket to Ride is so much bigger than I even realized. And I'm curious to kind of just like dip my toes into more. I have San Francisco pulled up on Miniature Market, so TBD.
Yeah. And I think my final thought is like, sometimes we cover a game on a deep dive and I'm like, okay, great. That will like close the book on that game. We played Messina, just to pick a random one, like a dozen times. And it's a big complex game. There's a ton going on and we have a great discussion about it. And that's it, and maybe I'll play it every once in a while. Where I feel like with Ticket to Ride, it's like a much smaller game. It's like a simpler game, but like, talking about it now, if anything, it just makes me like more eager to say like, did we get it right? Like, do we, what am I, missing still? Like, I want to go back to the drawing board. I want to keep playing it.
Let's play it at 3.
Yeah, let's play at 3. What do you guys say? Let's
do it.
All right, I'll go on to BGA and invite you. You want USA or Europe?
USA.
Yeah,
All right,
USA. All right, perfect. Well, let's end at that and thank our listeners so much for joining us on this week's episode. As always, if you want to join the conversation and share your takes on the decision space in Ticket to Ride, what you agreed with, what you didn't agree with, especially what you didn't agree with, please join us in the Discord and let's talk about it.
Until next time, thank you to Hembry for our intro and outro song, Reach Out.
Bye, y'all.
Thank you.